for that, I want us to take a look at Psalms 9 and 10. And if you have your Bibles, you might want to follow along with that, but it is printed off in your study guide there. Psalms 9 and 10 give us some insight on how to break that cycle of defeat in our lives. Psalms 9 and 10 probably belong together. They were probably sung together as an acrostic. And each stanza of the two combined, each stanza of the two starts with the successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And in fact, it is one psalm in the Septuagint, which is the oldest Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And it was used by the Greek-speaking Christians, including Joseph. They used that a lot. Now, the question may be asked, why don't we use the Septuagint today? And the fact is that we do. We rely on it heavily to translate the Bible into current languages. And I wanted to give you a comparison. This is, there, at the top of this, you'll see the Brenton translation, which is the translation of the Septuagint into English. And then you'll see the King James Version and the New International Version of Psalms 9, 1 and 2. And I use the King James Version a lot to study. I use the NIV to teach from because it's just kind of a common language. But when I teach, I really like to do word studies and get into what the meanings of the words are and how they apply to our lives. But this will kind of give you some insight. The Brenton out of the Septuagint basically is I will give thanks to thee, O Lord, with my whole heart. I will recount all thy wonderful works. I will be glad and exult in thee. I will sing to thy name, O thou most high. Then by the time we get to the New International Version, this is what it says. I will praise you, O Lord, with all my heart. I will tell of your wonders. I will be glad and rejoice in you. I will sing praise to your name, O most high. So it's basically the same thing. And so I want us to take a look at this, but understand that this was something that they sang. They understood. Psalm 9 and 10 was a very favorite passage. It was a favorite psalm for early Christians and certainly for the Hebrews. And let's take this psalm and break down how we can break the defeat cycle in life. And we'll start with Psalm 9, and I want you to understand what Psalm 9 basically says. Psalm 9 basically says God can be depended on. You can depend on God. Even in those times in your life when everything seems to be falling apart and you can't get out of that defeat cycle, things seem to happen over and over and over again, you can still depend on God. The first 8 verses of this psalm are a focus on this awesome, established, all-powerful God who reigns forever and will continue to judge the world by his righteousness. And it's a declaration and a reminder that God is faithful and God can be trusted, even in those times when everything seems to be falling apart. Even when we think that we are going to step into another cycle of defeat, we can still trust in God, and we need to take refuge. And that becomes a key word in this passage. Refuge in God, who will judge and even avenge unrighteousness. Now notice David's recall of how God had seen him through difficult times before. In verses 3 through 6 of Psalm 9, my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before you. For you have upheld my right and my cause. You have sat on your throne judging righteously. You have rebuked the nations and destroyed the wicked. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. Endless ruin has overtaken the enemy. You have uprooted their cities. Even the memory of them has perished. Now that seems strange coming from a guy who used to write about how everything seemed to be going against him and how his enemies were trying to ensnare him and throw him into the pit and how he had slipped. And all of, some of those psalms by David are just, you read them and you go, man, this guy was manic depressive. And you look at this passage and you think, wait a minute, is this the same guy? Yeah, it's the same guy. David knew that he could depend on God in times of despair and trouble because he had in the past. And so one of the things that we have to learn is when we are going to break that cycle of defeat in our lives, we have to come to grips with this fact that God really can be depended on, even if we're having trouble and struggling with that in our lives right now. In fact, Psalms 9, verse 7 and 8 says, the Lord reigns forever. He has established his throne for judgment, which is a playoff on the word forever. He is established on his throne of judgment forever. He will judge the world in righteousness. He will govern the peoples with justice. And so there is a declaration in these first 8 verses of Psalm 8 that God can be depended on. And we have to grab a hold of that one simple truth, even if we're having trouble understanding it and really believing it in our circumstances. So verses 9 through 15 begin to play on this word that I mentioned earlier, this idea that God is a refuge. And one of the ways that you get a hold of the fact that you really can depend on God is that you learn to use God as a refuge. That is the first step in breaking the defeat cycle. You go to God as a refuge. Verses 9 and 10. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. Those who know your name will trust in you, for you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. Now, the word for refuge means a lofty, inaccessible place of safety. I have been doing this as we've prepared for our First in Action team that we're going to be doing, their crisis response team from the church. One of the things that I've been studying a lot is about crisis management. And one of the things that I've really come to discover more so than ever before is how the stage of crisis management and healing develops. One of the first things that happens when we go into crisis mode, and when we talk about crisis, we're talking about how we respond to an incident. The crisis isn't, say, the tornado or the flood or the divorce or the lost job. That is the incident. That's what counselors will refer to as the critical incident. The crisis comes on how you handle that. That's the crisis. And so one of the ways that we handle it, the immediate reaction is that fight or flight attitude, where something has happened and I've got to do something to protect myself. And it's interesting because physiologically something happens in our brain. Normally there's a part of our brain where we make these cognitive decisions. We're logical, we think things through, and we can make good decisions. There is another part of our brain that controls the emotions. And what happens when we find ourselves in a crisis situation, when we find ourselves desperate or defeated, what happens is that there is a change in the physiology of our body where there is more attention given to that part of the brain, the emotional part of the brain, and we begin to make decisions with that emotional part, and that is that fight or flight reaction. It's almost like this adrenaline kicks in and you do something, whatever you have to do immediately to save your life. What the problem with that is that you stop thinking clearly with the logical side because you're now thinking with the emotional side of the brain. That's just physiological. That's something that we know is true and it happens and it's been proven medically. But the second thing that happens after we begin making those choices out of emotion and out of fear or out of the desire to protect ourselves is that the second thing that we desire is a desire to be safe. And the author of one of the books that I'm reading, in fact, it's Kevin Ellers, is Kathy Ellers' brother. It talks about in his book about he had this horrible accident, and he was lying on in the emergency room in the bed, and they'd come in and they'd done all the checking and everything on him. He was in considerable pain, but they realized that he wasn't going to die. He was going to get a lot of pain. It was going to be a time of recovery, but he wasn't going to die. And so they had pretty much left the room, and he was in the room by himself, and he felt that loneliness and that being frightened, and he just didn't know what to do. And a nurse came in, and she noticed that he was really frightened and feeling all alone and a little teary-eyed. And she brought a warm blanket and put it over him and just tucked him up. And he said that response was so life-changing for him because he realized at that point how desperate he was to be safe. And he began to realize that about the people that he counseled. When people go into panic modes and they go into crisis modes, there is this incredible desire to be safe. Just to know that I'm going to be okay. And I'm going to be able to survive this. But you have to feel safe before you can start making those cognitive, those good, right decisions again. And so refuge in God is really critically important, not only from a physiological standpoint, but from a spiritual standpoint also. You need to feel safe to be able to make right decisions. And the only way that you're going to be able to feel safe is if you find your refuge in God. And you can go to God and say, God, I know that I can trust you. I don't know how this is going to work out, but I know that I can find safety in you. And so refuge is this lofty, inaccessible place of safety. That's what the word means. And there are two ways that God becomes a refuge for us. First of all, he becomes a refuge when we are, as this verse points out, when we are oppressed. And the word that's used for oppressed means injured or hurt or afflicted. And that happens so many times in our lives. Things happen to us, not just physically hurt, but sometimes emotionally hurt, and sometimes spiritually hurt, and financially hurt, and all these other different ways that we can become injured. But it is all inclusive on those. God says that you can find refuge in me when you are oppressed. It doesn't just mean oppressed by someone, but when you are injured, when you are hurt, when you are afflicted. The second time, and the second place that we need to find refuge, is when we are in times of trouble, which is a completely different word. And that word means, literally, distressed by an enemy. When you are under attack, when you are distressed by an enemy, now it could be another person, it could be a circumstance, it could be, just the economy, or it could be actual danger, any harmful danger where your life is in danger, any of those things where you are distressed by an enemy. Isn't it amazing that God says, look, in those times, whether it is a time where you are injured or hurt or afflicted, or whether you are distressed by an enemy, you can find refuge in me. You can feel safe. And when you feel safe, then you can start to make the right decisions. Now, how do you find refuge in God? Well, verse 10 gives us that insight. Verse 10 is the pivot verse for this psalm. It is such an important verse because in this verse we find that, and it is the central truth, if you will, of this psalm. In this verse we find that there are really four things, but two specific things that we need to do. The first thing is we need to trust. Trust. Now, the word for trust, which is the word batach, and it means to have confidence, to find confidence. And it's not just, okay, I'm going to be confident. It's a bold confidence. That's literally what the word means, a bold confidence. Well, you don't just suddenly decide to be boldly confident. That doesn't just happen. It's not a decision. It's not a choice. I'm going to be confident. That's dumb. We don't just make that decision to be confident. How does that happen? Confidence comes by experience. It comes by learning to trust God. And I want to jump ahead and come back to this in just a moment. But that's the first element. We need to learn to trust. The second thing is that we have to seek. See that in the verse? We're to seek God. And that means that there needs to be this, and the word that's used literally means worshipful inquiry. God says, I want you to make a worshipful inquiry. Now, notice the affirmation that God has never forsaken those who seek Him. When there is a worshipful inquiry, when you are seeking God, when you need God, when you know that God is the answer for your life, when you are seeking after God, God has never forsaken you. He will reveal Himself. Now, He may not reveal Himself the way that you want Him to reveal Himself. And so you need to be cognizant and open and listening and looking for the ways that God reveals Himself. But God will reveal Himself. He has never forsaken those who seek Him. And then I want you to notice the qualifier. The qualifier is that this is all for those who know your name. Now, just knowing the name of God, that God, is not enough. The idea of knowing the name of God means that you have taken the name of God as the authority of your life. That's the idea. In fact, the word that's used for know is this word yada. And it means to have an intimate knowledge of who you are in God. The word yada is intimate knowledge. That's the idea. In fact, it's the same word when it says that Adam knew Eve and she conceived in early Genesis. It's that word of being so close that you become intimate with God. You become one with God.